the people within your congregation are complex, yet very real human beings who have very real, consistent needs. And the best thing you can do is identify a diverse group of people within your community, across generations, across racial and ethnic lines, across genders, people that are outside the community, that are somewhat disillusioned with the community and somewhat like all in fans of the community, and say, hey, help us craft the vision of the future. What type of church do we want to be so that in 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, our kids, we're not going to be telling the story about the ways that our kids never came back, but that they actually might have stayed, that they stayed because of the things that we were doing, that they were so moved by our church's commitments that they oriented their whole life to our faith commitment.
Hi there, Faith Roundtable listeners, thanks, and viewers. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Faith Roundtable, of course, with a sister podcast of Faithful Politics. And it all comes out on this channel. I'm Josh Burtram. I am your host and the faithful host on Faithful Politics. So make sure you guys like, subscribe, do all the things that hack the algorithm for YouTube so that we can get this great content out to more people. And you guys know, if you've been listening, that the Faith Roundtable is about bringing on thought leaders and theologians and scholars and pastors and leaders in the Christian church in America and beyond, but to talk about issues that are going on in the 21st century now with the church and to wrestle with those things. And today we have a very important conversation that we're going to dive in with my guest, Raymond Chang. He is the author, one of the co-authors of Future Focused Church. He is the executive director of 10 times 10 collaboration at Fuller Seminary, a movement aimed at reaching 10 million young people with the gospel over the next 10 years. He also serves as president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, bringing extensive experience in ministry and leadership across diverse cultural contexts. He has lived in Korea, Guatemala, Panama, Spain, and China, and has traveled to nearly 50 countries. I am jealous, Ray. And he has also worked both for-profit and non-profit sectors. And of course, we're going to talk about his book, Future Focused Church, that he co-authored with Kara Powell and Jake Mulder. Ray, it is so good to meet you. Thank you for jumping on the program today.
It's great to be with you, Josh. Thanks so much for having me, and I appreciate all the good work that you're trying to do to show that people from opposing political views can actually get along, especially if they place
Yes.
their faith above all else.
Come on, somebody. Absolutely. Well, thank you for that encouragement. And so I want to just jump right into the content of your book, if that's cool with you.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. So you wrote a book, Future Focused Church. I would love for you to kind of describe, help me understand the title, help our audience understand the title. I mean, we can think, oh yeah, we want to focus on the future, but why'd you name it that? And what's going on? What's the basic premise of this book for our audience?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. The reason I called it the Future Focused Church is not because we want to get rid of the past or neglect the present, but because we want to take a comprehensive view and lean into the vision that God has for the church, which is its flourishing and its positive Christian witness. And so as we were doing studies, we realized that there are a lot of there's a lot of sentiment around whether religion and churches are relevant anymore. Christian Smith came out with a new book about why religion went obsolete. And it basically feels like it's become fairly outdated in the US, somewhat like a CD player in a world of Spotify or a typewriter in a world of laptops and touchpads. But we also know that spirituality is on the rise. And most young adults today would say that they're spiritual. More than 70% of people born between the years 2000 and 2006 believe that there's something beyond the natural world. And so
Wow.
we want to lean into that and help churches embrace that future, which is very much present, but then make the right pivots without losing themselves or losing all of the things that they value, or even losing the things that they hold in terms of what, in terms of we think that you can move forward without neglecting the past, and you can bring the best of the past and the present into the future.
I love that. That is so good. And one of the things that is in your book is this vision for a church that relationally disciples young people. And I'm assuming also beyond young people, right? Modeling kingdom diversity and actually bringing tangible, real acts of love for our neighbors. I'd love you to go into a little bit more depth and even bring in some of your cross-cultural experience for how you've seen these things. How do they show up cross-culturally? Like, are they universal in their importance?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, we're seeing with the 10 by 10 collaboration, one of the things that we're seeing is that it's all kind of generated out of a strong sentiment that something needs to happen because there's a million young people walking away from the faith every single year. If nothing changes by
That's wild,
2050,
man.
if nothing changes by 2050, 35 to 42 million young people are estimated to disaffiliate from the Christian faith. It's not just walking away from the church, but it's saying, I no longer want to be identified as a Christian or have anything to do with Jesus. And so that concerns us. And we see the same kind of trajectory and, laid out by Pew. And so we think that the church needs to prioritize young people. It needs to prioritize reaching, resonating with, and discipling young people relationally, because the principles don't change. When you look at what Jesus did, the first thing Jesus did was invite people into a relationship, and then he
Yes.
invited people into a relationship together. And as a group and as a community, they moved forward, learning about, walking with, talking with, and modeling the way of Christ as they saw him live out his life and show them what a faith in him would look like. And then, of course, with the increasing diversity in the US, where now the majority of those that are under the age of 20 are coming from racialized minority backgrounds, the church should be more of a unifying force than a segregating force. And yet what we see more often than not is that the church still kind of remains one of the most segregated entities and institutions throughout the country. And you dig a little bit further, and what you realize is that most of the diversity that we see in the church today, especially within the Protestant church, is due to racialized minorities going into churches that are led, shaped by dominant of the kind of the white majority, and not the other way around. And so while we understand why ethnic minority churches exist and their unique place and space, we also believe that diversity is an extremely kind of important aspect of the kingdom of God, because whether we like it or not, people that look as different as you and I do and more are going to be worshiping God together as we profess faith in Jesus for all
That's
of eternity.
yes.
And so why not start here so that we show the way of the kingdom here now? And then, of course, when it comes to tangibly loving our neighbors, people are no longer interested in a faith that just is all about propositions and axioms and cute statements. They want to see a
Mm,
faith that makes a difference in the world that they live in. They want to see a faith that their neighbors resonate with. They want to see a faith that those that are oftentimes ostracized by the church would find compelling. And so young people especially are wondering, what difference does the Christian faith make in the world that we live in? And one of the ways that we demonstrate that is by being light and salt in cities on hills, and candles not hidden by baskets or covered by baskets, but actually placed on lampstands, shining into the world so that it's visible and making a tangible difference.
well, you said so many good things there. I'm like, there's so many directions I have like in my brain. Like I have like questions that I have to ask, but then I'm always like thinking of things that get said, and I wanna move down that direction. So you said a couple things that I don't want people to miss. Several things. 1 million young people a year. Okay. 35 million by 2050, you said? Like just
35
in
to 42
America.
million just in the US.
Just in America, that is massive.
That's massive. That's an
Massive.
entire that's
So we got this massive exodus, and yet some churches are growing like gangbusters. Many of them are closing, right? Some churches grow like gangbusters. And again, there's a lot of controversy around megachurch and stuff like that. I don't have any issues with mega churches, like in any like inherent sense or anything. What I do find issue is a lot of times people think, oh man, things are going great because these a few churches, minority of churches are exploding in growth. But if a minority of churches are exploding in growth, many churches are closing, 1 million people are leaving, young people are leaving a year, there's something going on in these numbers that's not making sense. So I guess the question I have, and you said something else that I'll get to, which is I've heard it called the browning of America, in the sense that like, or the non-whitening, right? That like you talked about racialized under 20, that racialized minorities are the majority. Is that what I heard you
Yeah.
say?
Yeah.
So that is another thing I don't want us to skip for people that are listening, because it's like, especially my white brothers and sisters, we can put our heads in the sand and not realize like, hey, culture is changing, whether we like it or not. So I'll get to that. But what's going on in your research? Why are young people leaving?
I mean,
What
there's a
is the
variety of
cause
reasons.
of this massive exodus?
I mean, there's a variety of reasons. I think, it ranges from, I mean, Barna did a study and they said hypocrisy is the number one reason why people outside of faith communities would struggle to enter into or trust those within faith communities. So hypocrisy is number one. Our approach to science and, the incompatibility, not necessarily the ways in which, yeah, so the incompatibility, the sense that we as Christians are perceived to view science as completely incompatible with faith, which we know is not necessarily true. There are many great
No,
organizations
definitely not true.
and a lot of Christians that are actually in scientific fields, but yet the perception is that Christians are anti-science. And then you have a host of other things. There's some studies that are done, and it depends on the community, it depends on the group, but there are things from church hurt to church trauma that people have experienced, so they no longer want to be a part of a faith community. Other parts of the church are wrestling with things like crystals and sage and other forms of spirituality, as well as
Yeah,
compelling things that are drawing them away from Christian spirituality. Other things are like, everyone's just doing community better. I think that there's an element in which sororities and fraternities and gym memberships and everything else
man.
in between are just doing community better. And belonging is a really significant and inherent need that every person has. We want to be known, we want to be heard, we want to be seen, we want to be loved. And you find that in spaces outside of the church as much as you find it in the church now. You find it online. People are finding their friends and building community on video games now, and that's a very real thing. And then, there was a study done by Arbor Institute, which is one of the 10 by 10 partners, that also says that, when they asked a group of students why their peers were leaving the church, they said three reasons: that the church is irrelevant, that it's unloving, and it's inauthentic. It's irrelevant in the sense that it doesn't address the topics and kind of communicates things in a very awkward and kind of unrelatable manner, unloving in that it doesn't know how to love people that are different than them. And then it's inauthentic in that it doesn't seek to primarily serve the people that are within, but use the people, that it seeks to be manipulative, to try to force people to believe something that they don't know if they fully believe yet. And so the relational piece is out of the picture when you're just trying to download information into someone's head and get them to agree with you with their mouth, instead of journeying with them so that the belief settles into their heart. And so those are a few of the reasons why people are leaving. And of course, there's a lot more. So there's no like single thing that's leading
Right.
people to leave. I mean, it could even be that parents just stop going to church and their kids never
Yeah.
experience church, or their parents kind of prioritize youth sport leagues, which is a great form of cultivating discipline and helping people build like life skills and potentially become a professional athlete. But at the same time, when they go to college, and parents shouldn't be that surprised when they're skipping church to go and do a hobby, or when they're playing sports,
Yeah.
and
Of
and
course.
so on and so forth. And so there's no single answer is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I remember being in church as a teenager, right? So I'm 39, I'll turn 40 this year. I'm in church as a teenager back in the early 2000s, and I remember hearing that in college, young people are leaving the church at a surprising rate. 18-year-olds, they go to college, they leave, and then college ministries were started, and all this stuff happened like as a result of trying to reach this this demographic. And it feels like now we're now living in the result of decades of this happening. And it just seems like it's just accelerating. It's not slowing down at all. It's just accelerating. And so I get when I'm looking at this, I'm like, man, it feels so overwhelming. But before I do get into that, like, talk to me a little bit more about the idea of the racialized minorities rather becoming the majority. Like, what does this mean? What does this mean? I know maybe it sounds obvious, but just clearly spell it out. What does this mean? And what is being predicted? How, in your research and your understanding, how is this going to change and affect the way that we have to do church?
Yeah, I mean, Barnard recently released a study that the church is that most church growth is a result of transfer growth. 80% of all church growth that we're seeing is a result of transfer growth. And so that means that it's not really because people are being evangelized and people are coming to faith anew. They're just playing church musical chairs. They're going from one church to
Yeah.
another. And to your point about, a lot of these other churches, like some churches growing because other churches are dying, that's absolutely right. There are estimates that suggest that, since the pandemic, about a third of the churches in the U.S. closed down. I can say
Lord.
that's definitely true within the Asian American Christian community and the Asian American
Really?
church landscape. I don't know if that's true everywhere, but even in LA, within the Korean church network, one of the kind of things that we've studied and we've been learning through the Asian American Christian Collaborative is that it went from over 1,400 churches to just under 900 churches
My
in less than
goodness.
6 years, right? And so that's a massive decline. But we're also seeing that there's an increase of diversity, especially those under the age of 20 and 21, that for the first time in US history, it's a majority minority country. And it's not by immigration necessarily or primarily, it's mostly by birth rate. And so because the country has been diversifying over time, and there are complications in history, right? We know that there are seasons in which families were separated and torn apart, that Asians were excluded from the US for nearly 80 years.
Yeah.
So the population was kind of prevented from diversifying. It's now diversifying and it's diverse. And so the norm for a lot of young people is diversity. The norm for them is to see people that are different from them and see that as a regular thing, not as a novelty. I remember when I grew up,
Right.
when people saw me, they're like, "You're the first Asian American I've ever encountered." That was one of the first conversations I had when I went to college. I went to Christian
Wow.
college, and that I remember having that conversation. I was like, "Wow." And I was like, "You're not
You're
the
like,
first
wow.
white, yeah, you're not the first white guy I've ever seen, but I'm glad you are the first, Asian American, and I love you for it, but you got a little more catching up to do than I do."
Yes.
But so there are pieces like that, and so what that means is that where the church really struggles in probably one of the most significant ways, which is the race issue and the culture issue, and especially the dominant majority being able to articulate and see their own cultural blind spots and deficiencies. The younger people are just not interested in teaching older generations how to interact with people that are different than them. They actually celebrate it more to the point where,
Hmm.
even at like a surface level, a friend of mine is a pastor in New York, and he said, and we were talking about how when we were growing up, people would make fun of us when we brought our Korean American food. And what Aaron, who's the pastor of Exilic,
Wow.
said was that now all of his friends, all of his kids' friends who are from Latino, white, African American, indigenous communities, they come and take his food so that they can eat it because they love it. And, it's just a different world that they're living in than what we
Yes.
are.
I mean, that is totally, totally true. I mean, I planted a church 5 years ago. We were in a house and then we moved into a building. It's still pretty small, and yet the diversity even within my church is amazing. And I even have some of my friends, and my black friends are like, I can't believe, like, my kids, they grow up and they don't feel the same way I did. Like, they don't feel like they don't belong. They don't feel, because there's so much more diversity. Is like, and I even struggle to know how to help them with some of the stuff that they are, because they're not dealing with the same issues. I mean, there's overlap, no doubt, but there's also not dealing with the exact same issues. And I would love to dig in. Like, we talk about moving from here, our current reality to our desired future, right? You're talking about in the book. How do we do that? And how did this kind of collaboration that you had with Kara and Jake, how did these diverse perspectives, how did they affect the writing process as you guys were working through this? Those are kind of two separate questions, so you can
Yeah.
treat them separately.
Yeah, so Kara Powell and Jake Mulder, they are my co-authors, phenomenal thinkers and writers. And, Kara Powell is probably one of the most seasoned and most significant voices in youth ministry in the U.S. And then Jake has been with the FYI and the leadership world for a while. And so, we wrote this book together, and it was great because we were able to kind of sharpen each other, add to things, question what needed to be questioned, challenge what needed to be challenged. And I think that's what helped this book to become such a great resource, and one that I think everyone can benefit from, regardless of their background, especially because we drew from a variety of diverse churches throughout the country. We studied about 1,000 different churches along with the Fuller Youth Institute and their team. And so there was a lot of great things to just mine from, and then simultaneously the writing process was an enjoyable one, in part because we think that this is a gift to the church that the church can use, and that leaders who are wondering, what can I do next? What's the first thing? What's the second thing? What's the third thing that I need to do? How do I even organize my next season so that left behind in ministry, but that we're actually leading ahead of some of the trends that we are seeing, because leaders are dedicated and drained. Our churches are shrinking, they're also aging, and they're not getting younger. And those are all things that we want to help church leaders address, and address well, without losing the people that are already in their communities and still in their communities, but also helping cast vision. In terms of the 10 by 10 collaboration, it's a pretty dynamic collaboration of 160 organizations, or of over 160 organizations. You can check it out on tenx10.org or 1010.org. And what we are essentially trying to do is serve the local church community by equipping and training it with some key resources and frameworks to help activate intergenerational relational discipleship, and then also to really think about ways to address the credibility gap of the church, to address the reasons why young people are leaving, to address the conditions of the water that prevent young people from even wanting to engage with faith communities or engage with Christians in whatever spaces that they're in. And so, yeah, we're really thrilled about what we're doing.
I
But you were
love it.
saying that here, we have
Yeah. So
yeah.
give us a little bit, give us a preview, or maybe like a bird's eye view of the roadmap that you guys
Yeah.
have thought about and discovered as you're moving forward, and we can dig into more of the elements as we're moving along.
Yeah. So like I shared, we studied over 1,000 churches as they've prayerly focused on becoming more future focused. According to Harvard Business Review, there was a study that showed that 70% of all change efforts fail. And we know that change is hard, but it's also possible. And through our studies of diverse churches in size and theology, a lot like those who are probably listening in today, we realize that there are four very important zones towards change. It's not a quick fix, but it is a process that is far more simple than you can imagine. They emerge in four words. It's here, there, who, and how. Here is where we are now and why we are here. This includes your physical location, your people, your culture, your resources, your current sense of life and vitality, the infrastructure, the program, and so much more. It's painting a picture of where things are at the moment. It's having a sober vision of what's happening. The there is where God is leading the community. Where is God leading us is basically the question. And it's where you and your community picture your church 6 months, 6 years, or 60 years from now. The who is who are the people in the congregation or the ministry and wider community who must shape this effort. Now, in most churches, this encompasses your overall congregation, your leaders, as well as people who are not yet part of the church, but you hope to engage. But one of the things that we encourage people to do is to begin with a transformation team, to identify people from different segments of the community, and then to engage them in a process to help craft the vision of the future, to help lead the change efforts, and to really kind of pave the way forward so that the changes last and endure. And then the how is, what's our next faithful step? And how might we move towards a more faithful future? And so those four words, here, there, who, how, really provide a map or a framework for what people can engage in to move in a direction towards the future without losing their sense of who they are now.
I love that. I want to ask like a little bit of I don't know if philosophical question is the right word, but when we're thinking about a million, I mean, it's just a staggering number leaving. Um, and we're thinking about the causes of this, and there's so many different causes. And let me just give a little bit of context, like thinking about how Christianity started, right? This small, obscure Jewish sect that, had this Messiah that for everyone else, this basically false Messiah that had been crucified by the Roman government. They claimed, right? And we believe he's raised from the dead. I believe that with all my heart. He was raised from the dead, resurrected, Son of God.
Yeah, there
But
is
this
no
progress,
Christianity without resurrection.
there's no Christianity without resurrection. And I believe that to the deepest. I mean, it's my hope, man. No, it's the thing I do cling on to for hope. And like we're thinking about this group that grew under persecution, right? And then became like essentially almost favored, not overnight, but just metaphorically overnight, right? By Constantine. We're looking at America, we're looking at where we are now, and you go back to the 50s, and I know there's been all sorts of studies like church attendance and who was in, and it's been up and down in America. We've had people on the podcast that have talked about that. But I guess my question is like, how much of this, and you're just with your, and just like in your intuition, how much of this is like, hey, people are just leaving something that's not genuine anyway? Like they're like the million people, they're leaving something not like, of course I don't want them to leave the faith, but are they leaving something that wasn't really Christianity? It was cultural Christianity or something like Christian nationalism, quote unquote. And that might be anachronistic. I don't know. I actually don't think so. But like something like, were they leaving something that wasn't real Christianity because like, hey, because it wasn't really fulfilling its promises because it couldn't. It didn't have any of the power of what real Christianity, empowered by the Holy Spirit, would have. How much of it is that? So it's not, and it's not like I'm trying to say it's not a crisis because I feel that, and I feel that deeply. But is it almost like maybe they're leaving that, and when they get exposed to true, what real Christianity is, like what you guys are talking about, that will actually, like, it's almost like silver lining, or it's almost like, like some good news within the bad. I don't know. What do you think about that? I'm not asking for agreement in any way. Just kind of process that out loud. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is always going to be an element of cultural Christianity, no matter where Christianity is the dominant faith or religion, right? And so, yeah, I I don't know if people are actually leaving a cultural Christianity, or they're leaving a Christianity that was just hypocritical or something else, or if there's kind of, powers and principalities at work that are drawing them away from faith. Because I mean, I believe in a long view with God. Like,
Yeah,
there's no single moment that like defines all of our lives.
right.
And so until the final word is said, I'm always kind of waiting in hope and waiting in faith and waiting in love. At the same time, I think that we could say people are recoiling from a perception of Jesus because Jesus still has a great reputation. It's the church that
Mm,
has a poor reputation. Like, when people think about Jesus, they
right.
want more Christians to be like Jesus. They would hope that more Christians are like Jesus, and yet they're not necessarily seeing that on the day to day or the month to month or the year to year. They're seeing, what you articulated as the Christian nationalist Jesus, or the cultural Christian, or
Yeah.
some other version of Christianity that really is more obsessed with power and dominance than service and sacrifice. that
Hmm.
it's more interested in cultural control than it is in cultural humility.
Come
And
on.
so, what I think is that, wherever the Spirit of God is, there's freedom, and wherever the Spirit of God is life. And I think where people are actively following Jesus and following Jesus in community, you will see those communities become vibrant spaces, places, showcases for the work and hand of God in this world. And even in the midst of all the bad news, all the decline, all of the really like kind of depressing information, there are so many wonderful stories of hope. Small communities
Hmm.
all throughout the country that are meeting faithfully and not failing to gather together, to pray together, to worship together, to serve together, to give together, to love together. And in the ways that they are doing so, they are bearing witness to a resurrected Jesus who is coming again in full glory, bringing about a renewed kingdom so that we will one day all flourish together in eternity. But there's a part of me that wonders if you can see it as a form of purging right now, where, the
Hmm.
wheat and the chaff are being separated and the chaff are
Yeah,
being
yeah,
burned
yeah, yeah.
away. And what people perceive to be Christianity in terms of the dominant narrative is actually being challenged and pressed against and pushed against so that a more faithful Christian understanding can emerge. And if it's not a purging, then what we're seeing is some form of judgment because, God can give us into our own desires. And, we've seen that with the judges. Everyone wanted, God gave them into what they wanted for themselves. And so, yeah, so there's so many ways that you can look at it. I think I'm not fully sure what the question was, so I'm not sure if I answered the question.
It was more of my musings, than a real clear question. I mean, you definitely answered as far as I'm concerned, because it's like what I was getting at is basically what you said. Like, it's just wrestling with, hey, man, like God may be purging some things, right? Like, because the dominant Christian model was not really representing Christ. It wasn't really sacrificial. It wasn't doing the things that would please the heart of God. Like, because I guess the question comes from, if the gospel is real, which to the bottom of my heart, I believe that it is. And I have more reasons to just, I feel like it is, but I truly believe it is. Like, that is something so attractive, right? Something so, like, who doesn't want to be loved that much? Who doesn't want to have a father that cares for them that much? Who doesn't want to have, like, who would not, I'm saying that everyone would like just believe that just because we say it, but there's this desire for us. Like, it's so attractive. Who wouldn't want a community of people committed to their good, loving them, serving them, there for them through ups and downs? And it just makes me feel like that's not what we've had. We've had something else. And I think that's what you're almost bringing at. And so if I think about the past, I was just musing with a friend today about, you remember Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames? Did you grow up in, okay, so it's
Vaguely.
like, so basically, there's these things where like someone would basically make a mistake and they got into a car crash because they drank, or or they didn't really, someone was trying to give them the gospel and they weren't really feeling it. They're hardworking people. They weren't, but they didn't really like religion. They had bad experience, so that's not for them. And then they died, and all of a sudden Satan comes out, the scariest looking dude you've ever seen with the scariest voice. And literally him and his minions drag it was a play that they would go around the church. They drag that person to hell. And then the person is begging for their life. And then when they get them into the fire, like the flames, the person screams, and there's like this trap door under the stage, and they fall into it. And then you hear their blood curdling screams. And it's like, and then the altar call comes. And again, I'm not,
To scare people into heaven.
basically, dude, like, I'm not saying, I'm not making a claim about hell here. What I'm saying is like, that's what I grew up with.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah. Hellfire and
And
brimstone. Yes, yes,
yeah,
yes.
basically,
Yeah.
like, I'm going to scare you. And hell can be a very convincing scare tactic for little kids and for people that would have a frame that would believe in that. And of course, again, I'm not arguing with the reality, whatever, hell's a biblical concept. What I'm getting at is the way in which it was used. And what I'm getting at is like just giving an example, like, man, if that's what I grew up with, I'm scaring you. That's the past. How do we build? You mentioned like we need to get rid of certain things in the past, find the things that are good, build to go to the future. How do we do that? How do we distinguish the things from the past that were worth keeping versus the things like, hey, we really need to get rid of that? Essentially, how do we deconstruct, that big movement, deconstruct? How do we take those things out and reconstruct on something?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I mentioned earlier that one of the things that we need to do is discern well together. We have to see what, God is calling us to do. And I think a big part of that, one of the things that we encourage people to do, especially leaders, is to begin with listening and listening deeply. I think one of the biggest failures we face as a church is that we haven't cultivated the discipline of listening well because we think we are primarily about communicating and speaking instead of listening. And, we have to
That's
listen
so
both
good.
to God and to those in our communities and those outside of our communities in the same way that someone once said that, in order to preach, you have both the Bible in your hand and a newspaper in the other. You have to apply what the truth of God's word is to the reality of the day and of the time. And the people within your congregation are complex, yet very real human beings who have very real, consistent needs. And the best thing you can do is identify a diverse group of people within your community, across generations, across racial and ethnic lines, across genders, people that are outside the community, that are somewhat disillusioned with the community and somewhat like all in fans of the community, and say, hey, help us craft the vision of the future. What type of church do we want to be so that in 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, our kids, we're not going to be telling the story about the ways that our kids never came back, but that they actually might have stayed, that they stayed because of the things that we were doing, that they were so moved by our church's commitments that they oriented their whole life to our faith community. And what that might look like, because when I used to work at a Christian college, I was always impressed when a church can get could get the college kid to not take the higher paying job elsewhere, but take the lower paying
Mm.
job in the neighborhood and say, I'm gonna go serve here and I'm gonna be here because one, I feel a strong sense of belonging to the community. Two, I feel a strong sense of connection to the mission. And three, this is where I'm growing in my faith and I'm seeing real tangible fruit that's emerging because of my participation in this community and change in the world because of my participation in this community. What would it look like to lean towards that?
I love that. And so what I'm hearing is like there's this discernment process that happens in community where we're looking, and then also it not only happens in community where there's like this self-assessment of like how well are we actually living this out. And the only way I know that is when I kind of get accountability from someone else. I'm talking to them, they know me, they know what's going on, they have freedom to speak into my life, they have freedom to challenge me with the scriptures in a loving way, and to ask questions or questions. On the other hand, I'm looking at culture and I'm saying, how are we even doing at reaching people that are not in this culture, far from God? Not are we just getting transfer growth, but are we getting people that don't know Jesus? Are we reaching into that segment at all? And what do we need to do to reach that? How can we do that? And start to just ask the questions that bring up more questions, that then bring up more, thinking and research and wondering and conversation, and do a lot of listening. I love when you said that. We feel like our only job is to preach as opposed to listen. Only job is to tell and to command and to proclaim, which is an important job, but not separated from a listening and understanding and empathy. Am I hearing that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. Truly believe that it's got to start with listening and then to discern your why because your community oftentimes knows what a compelling vision of a ragtag group of Jesus followers looks like. It's like it's almost like inherent within us. I mean, C.S. Lewis kind of talked about it in Mere Christianity, but we almost have a sense that if the Spirit is living within us, and if we have our Bibles in front of us, and if we're just able to like sit in front of each other and talk to each other and talk about what a Jesus abiding, Jesus following community can look like, that the answers are going to emerge within the gathered people.
I really, really like that. So, like, So I have this church plant. We have this group of people that come together. We eat together once a month. It's called River City Underground. It's in Richmond, Virginia. We eat together once a month. We, after every service, after every sermon and teaching, we process it together. We work through it together. We talk about, hey, is there anything confusing that we want to get clarity on from what this scripture says? Is there anything that we just don't buy? We don't believe it. We don't like, and trying to create a place where someone can express those doubts, express those things that are going on, and really try to discuss it, right? So we try to do that. And I'm giving you just some context on that. And then we try to have outreaches. We try to be intentional. We want to be able to grow so that we can do micro churches and things like that in neighborhoods. My question is, what advice do you have for me on starting to get future focused, right? And even taking what I have and learning to listen more. Like what would you tell me to do in this situation? What would be my next step for a guy like
Yeah,
me?
that's a great question. I mean, I think that you already have a sense of what's going on and like where God might be leading your community. I think one is listening to the dissenting voices. I think one of the things that would be helpful is to talk to those that might disagree with the ideas that you have and say, why do you disagree? And actually dig in. I also think that, as you're kind of navigating this kind of season of change, to get clear with the there, like where do you really want to be so that the church can, can give some tangible feedback. Describe the future vividly. Uh, in addition to that, I think listening to people outside of the church is also helpful. So one of the things I'm always encouraging people to do is talk to people that may or may not know of your church, but then ask them what type of church would make a difference for you, as you're walking around the streets of Richmond, and like what would be compelling for you to walk through our doors and what would be helpful for you to engage with our staff or our community members and what would get you to stay and be a part of this, ragtag misfit bunch of Jesus followers that are really trying to find ways to embody the kingdom here together. Because there are so many models that people can kind of adopt and adapt, and there's always going to be something that is going to spark an idea in someone. And sometimes those new models are the right models, and sometimes they're not. And one of the things I've seen is that if you change too much, you lose the congregation, and if you don't change
Right.
enough, you lose the congregation. And so there's a
Yes.
right pace of change that you have to adopt. And a big part of the ways that you do that is to both activate the transformation team so that you get a broad buy-in, and then also broaden the support as you get more clarity. So invite people into the process.
That's really good. One of the concepts that you bring out is this idea of pivoting potentially into one or more or potential futures. That is like thinking about the there. That's a little bit like scary because it's like you want to be able to be like so the pressure for a church leader is to be the one who has answers, right? And even though people may not like that anymore, there's enough people that give, or there's enough people that have, right? New young Christians, they don't give, right? They're not, I mean, that's just like a reality. I mean, at least for, in my experience and the experience of a lot of people I know, they just haven't learned, right, to do that or the discipline. And so, there you can become beholden to people that maybe do have more influence or do give, or they want to see a certain way, or we should start preaching like we used to, or whatever it is, right? And so you're supposed to be the one with the answers. And yet this idea that, hey, maybe there's 1, 2, 3 directions that we might go. What does that look like? And how do you start to like discern as you're moving forward which one that you might take? Is
Yeah,
it
one of the things.
constantly coming up with that?
Oh, no, I think that one of the things that you can, I mean, it depends on the church, right? Some churches are like, we just want to change all the time. If you get a bunch of people like me, we're always in it for the change, right? And
I hear
so
you, dude.
if you're not changing, there's something wrong. You're bored.
Same here.
And a big part of it is my ADHD, right? And then,
Same here, man.
but for other people, it's like change is too super scary, right? It's terrifying. One of the things that we encourage people to do in our book is to experiment from the edges. It means that you experiment as at the edges where you start small, you try things and see how it grows, how it garners traction, what the response is. Because if you start at the main service, for example, like it can be so disruptive that people are going to be terrified. You have to move people along in the process, but also, you also don't want to be
Mm,
held back by the people that aren't willing to change either, especially when change is necessary and you know that the Titanic is shrinking or the Titanic is sinking. And
yes.
so, if there's like multiple things that people are excited about, one of the things that you can do is bring groups together, committees together to try things out, but more at the edges of the community, and then see if it gets adopted more and more at the center.
I really like that. So I want to just talk about something controversial. And again, anything you say won't be held against you, and anything with me, and we can edit it out if we have to. So,
So no
so
cancel culture here.
yeah, no, there's no cancel culture. But I'm curious, right? And so here's the overall, and you can probably guess where I'm going to go once I say this kind of overall principle. If we're thinking about how do we maintain fidelity to the scriptures, to principles in the scriptures, and also relevant to the culture, and especially thinking about LGBTQ issues right now, because we have several people in my church that are in that are in that community. I love them, want to honor them, care for them, and really serve them. And there's different ideas of what that is. Some people are like, hey, the only way you're going to serve them is tough love. You got to tell them, and of course that comes from a certain interpretation, but you got to tell them, hey, this is what God thinks. This is what you have to do. Here's where you have to go. And then there's another group, literally within my church, there would be another group that would say, Jesus, the Holy Spirit will bring the conviction that he wants to bring whenever he wants to do it. So you just preach love, you just be fully accepting and all of that, and let Jesus do what he does best. Okay, let the Holy Spirit do that. Okay, get to these pressures that come on, and it feels like you give the wrong answer. Someone's hurt, someone's offended, they're leaving. And Jesus offended people and they left. I get that. He typically offended religious people, the religious elites. But he did offend people. So even I would just love to hear your thoughts and your research on what churches are doing this well. How do we move forward with like bringing the truth, exposing the truth, like staying committed to the authority of God and the scriptures, and also dealing with these really, really, really difficult issues of identity that get tied into political issues, that get tied into policy issues, that people they're very emotionally fraught. All of them. Every church is dealing with it, and every church has to deal with it if they haven't. If they haven't, then they're probably living in a pretty homogenous place, or reaching just a certain group of people. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. What do we do in these areas? And that's just one major area, but there's others. I mean, we're always going to hit stuff like that. Race is another one. I mean, race is another one where people have really different, well, quit with that woke stuff. And then other people are like, every Sunday needs to be about racial justice, right? And both of those things, that's another just example. How do we work through this as a future focused church?
Yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily dive into how we specifically handle controversial issues or issues that can potentially divide a community. One of the things that I mean, so this will be more my responses to you than anything
Yes, I'd
else.
love to hear that. Yeah.
But I mean, I'd say, I think one, study the life of Jesus and figure out, like, as a church, I would say, how would Jesus approach X, Y, or Z? Would Jesus tackle this issue? Would he avoid it? Would he go in head on? Would he lead with truth or would he lead with grace? What would he do? And I think that's probably the best thing you can start with, and invite the community and the congregation onto a journey together. Like, I think we often think that we have to kind of go off into a closet, figure things out, and then like present it to the community. And there are certainly things that we need to do that with, because you get too many cooks in the kitchen, then, the whole kitchen burns down. But there are ways that you can invite and involve the congregation more and more. And one of the things and this podcast seems to be one of the places that you're trying to model this, is that if you bring people who disagree together and you make them look at each other eye to eye, even if it's virtually, it's a lot harder to hate them and to villainize them and to typecast them as something that they're not or that they are, but you still like learn how to accept them like they're the crazy uncle. It's just, I think that there are ways that, that you can bring people into conversation together. And I think a lot of people are hungry for spaces where they can have meaningful and hard conversations. And that's one of the things I love doing. I love being in a room with people that are going to like have honest, earnest conversations together and then like wrestle things to the ground until we figure out like, okay, we actually agree to disagree, or here's a new way forward. And so that's one thing you can do is like actually ask Jesus, discern together how Jesus would approach things. I think it's also helpful to assess whether you're more of a quote unquote truth oriented church or more of a grace oriented church. Christianity calls for both, and we have to
Mm.
ask whether the truth that we hold is the truth that God holds, and then whether we are communicating the truth in the manner that God desires for us to communicate the truth, because we know that God in the person of Jesus spoke to different people differently, and we have to think about how Jesus spoke to those people, which is oftentimes lost in translation because we don't get to read the actual text in Aramaic or Greek and whatnot. But there's beautiful language that we see emerge. There's deeper compassion and sharper truth, and you see that in the scriptures. And I think in all seasons, we are to be both truth filled and grace filled, which means that if you are a truth oriented church, you probably have to lean more towards grace. And if you're a grace filled oriented church, you probably have to lean more into truth, because you can't be truly gracious without truth. And if we're about the truth of Jesus, then we have to embrace grace and adopt grace and express grace in everything that we do. You just can't choose one without the other. And then in terms of like what you do with people, let's say that you come to the conclusion that you are either fully affirming of different kind of sexual identities and sexual practices, or that no, those are not tolerable within our faith community. Then it's about discerning how much you are willing to tolerate within your own community that the
Mm.
opposing view and vision. When I look at the life of Jesus, what I see is Jesus had no problem holding space for people who absolutely disagreed with him and he would absolutely disagree with, and how
Yeah.
he navigated those things by asking way more questions than giving answers,
Mm.
and inviting them into a life journey with him. Those are things that I think we need to all consider.
I think that's really good. I really appreciate that. This is my last major like content question, and then we'll get on to just have a few housekeeping things on how people can connect with you at the end. So, if you were to hear stories, I've asked several authors this, if you were to hear stories about how this book has impacted someone, they give you an email, and maybe you already have that you could share, or they or you hear it in a text or whatever it may be, or you just hear it, through the grapevine. What kind of stories would let you know that this book has accomplished what you set out for it to accomplish when you started writing it?
Yeah, well, at least at the time of this recording, the book has not officially come out yet. So we don't have a whole bunch of stories in that realm. But we do have the stories of the churches that we've walked with. And then we do have stories of those that have read the advanced reader copies and that helpfully and graciously served as pre-readers to give us feedback on the book. And with all of them, one of the things that we've heard over and over and over again is that we've always known why we need to change or embrace change. We always knew that we can get to the what, but we didn't always know how to change. And what your book did was give us a clear way for how to change. And that's
Wow.
really the goal of the book, that it not only gave us some kind of checkpoints to meet and to be assessed by, but it gave us a roadmap for how to lead change in a very complex, human saturated world. And so that's probably the biggest thing, but adopting some of the principles in the book, we've seen churches grow from 100 to 1500. We've seen churches go from a higher median age to a lower median age. We've seen
Wow.
churches grow in its diversity and its capacity to love their neighbor. We've seen churches grow in their ability to engage with people that were different from them and actually make an impact in their communities, to the point where members of their communities appreciated their presence within the community. And so, those are a few of the things that we've been able to hear so far. But we're looking forward to hearing more, and we'd love to, get that feedback. If you use the book and read the book, please let us know how the book has impacted you, because all that feedback makes a difference to us and helps us think about the new questions we need to be addressing.
That's great. So how can people, like, when does the book come out? How can they get it? Or if there's a preferred place that you guys have? Obviously Amazon. I mean, that's what we all know everyone can get on the Amazon or major booksellers, but I don't know if there's a preferred place. Just kind of how can they get engaged with what you guys are doing, and what do you have coming up next?
It's coming out on March 25th. It's available at the Fuller Youth Institute store. You get some cool kind of freebies along with it, I think. And then, of course, it's also available on Amazon. So we encourage people to pre-order and then order. And then, there's the futurefocuschurch.com is where you can check it out. The Fuller Youth Institute is where you can check some more stuff out. And then the 10 by 10 collaboration, or 10by10.org. Make sure that you're following us on social media at 10 by 10 collab at Fuller Youth Institute. My personal social media is Ray Chang 50 on Instagram, and then of course I'm on Blue Sky as Raymond Chang.
Nice. Well, man, we're going to put all that in the show notes. And Ray, I really appreciate your time, your expertise, man. It's been such an enlightening, challenging, and overall just a great conversation. Thank you for spending some time with me today.
Thanks, Josh. It was great to be with you.
Absolutely. And to our friends and our viewers joining us, guys, thank you so much for joining us. We couldn't do this without you. We want to keep bringing you great content. Share this with someone that you feel like needs to hear it. Share this on social media. This is a message that needs to get out there. And let us know your feedback in the comments. We love to read and see what you guys think. And until next time, guys, take care of yourself. God bless, and we'll see you soon.